Now let's move into talking about information processing theory. Just some general principles of information processing theorists. Remember, information processing theorists really assume that human thinking is understandable via a computer model. So information processing focuses on cognitive operations and mental strategies that children use to transform stimuli flowing into their mental systems. In early childhood, the components of executive function that enable children to succeed in cognitively challenging situations include things like attention, impulse control, coordinating information in working memory, and planning. And they show impressive gains here in early childhood. So let's get started by first talking about attention. Attention is a process that determines which sensory information receives additional cognitive processing. Compared to older children, preschoolers are less able to pay attention to task-relevant information. So one way we can improve this is by removing irrelevant stimuli from the environment, and this would help make that more relevant information stand out. The orienting response occurs when individuals fix their eyes on a strong or unfamiliar stimulus, and we see that there's a change in physical heart rate and brainwave activity. So the orienting response alerts infants to new or dangerous stimuli. Habituation, then, is when there are lessened reactions to a stimulus after repeated representations, and this helps the infant ignore biologically insignificant events. So, where have we seen researchers capitalize on habituation? Hopefully you remember it was in the violation of expectation method. This is what the researchers do. They capitalize on habituation to investigate what infants know about hidden objects and other aspects of physical reality. So researchers might habituate babies to a physical event, expose them to an event until their looking time declines in order to familiarize them with the situation, and then they could test their knowledge. So then they could show babies an unexpected event or one that follows physical laws so they could show babies an expected event, so one that follows physical laws, or an unexpected event, one that violates physical laws. If there's heightened attention to the unexpected event, it suggests that the infant is surprised, essentially that they've oriented to that event. So they're surprised because it deviates from physical reality. And therefore, it shows us that that infant is aware of that aspect of their physical world. Another aspect related to information processing is learning. So learning can take many forms: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and imitation. Classical conditioning, we've talked a little bit about this before, but just a reminder, classical conditioning is a form of learning that involves pairing a neutral stimulus in a response that was originally produced by another stimulus. Through classical conditioning, infants learn that a stimulus is a signal for what will happen next. So when an initially neutral stimulus, like a bell, becomes able to elicit a response like salivation that previously was caused only by another stimulus, like food, classical conditioning has occurred. Now, what's interesting is that infants are capable of this conditioning, especially with feeding or other pleasant events. So an example of this would be like maybe right before you nurse a baby, you stroke their cheek, and then you'll see that they start to root around and they look for the nipple, and so that they now associate that cheek stroking with mama's milk. Another example of classical conditioning, I accidentally, classically conditioned my younger son, Rex, because we had some trouble getting him to sleep through the night. And so he would wake up and he would start crying, and I'd go into his room, and as soon as he heard the door open, he would immediately start crying because he learned to associate that noise of opening up the door with being held and being soothed. Another example of learning is operant conditioning. So this focuses on the relation between the consequences of behavior and the likelihood that the behavior will recur. So when a behavior's consequence makes this behavior's future occurrence more likely, that's a reinforcement. If it makes it less likely, that's a punishment. And then remember, you've got the positive and negative, which just has to do with, are you adding or taking something away? So if you give flowers to a girl and it results in you being kissed, you'll give those flowers more in the future. That's a positive reinforcement. If you give flowers to a girl and this results in you being slapped, so you stop giving flowers, that would be a positive punishment. Finally, imitation involves watching how others will behave and replicating that same behavior. So theorists think that there's evidence for mirror neurons in the brain. And these are neurons that fire when you're watching somebody perform a behavior. And I'm posting a video that shows an example of how these mirror neurons fire when you're looking at something and affect your behavior, even in just weeks-old infants. So please take a look at that.